Hello world, I'm Chris Pirillo, and this is your Geek Out for today. I'm going to give you a comparison of my experiences with Google's Nexus 10 and the 4th generation iPad from Apple. And before I begin, I do need to point out that I have a screen protector on my iPad at this point. It's there primarily to keep my fingerprints at bay. Sure, you could put a screen protector on the Nexus 10, but it doesn't seem to need one as much. It's so difficult to compare these two devices, if only because they're completely different, and they're trying to address the same audience. Side by side, the Nexus 10 is definitely taller, and just a tiny bit skinnier. The Nexus 10 is light, maybe just a hair lighter than the iPad 4. At 2048 by 1536 pixels, with a 9.7-inch screen on the iPad, like previous iPads, we have a PPI density of approximately 264. That's what Apple calls Retina. The Nexus 10, on the other hand, or in the same hand, has approximately a 10-inch display with a screen resolution of 2560 by 1600. That gives you approximately 299 PPI. By the way, PPI is short for pixels per inch. In my experience, with my eyes, the Nexus 10 may have been a hair sharper than the display on the iPad 4th generation, but it was hardly much of a difference. Or maybe it's a law of diminishing returns. And don't get me wrong, the higher PPI, the better. As far as colors go, there's definitely better saturation on the iPad 4 screen. My red curtains are a bit muted, and that black shirt seems to be not as black on the Nexus 10 screen, especially when compared to the iPad 4. In my hand, the Nexus 10 felt comfortable. Probably more comfortable than the iPad 4, if only because Google went with a plastic back, which provided somewhat of a grip, versus a metal back on the iPad 4, which doesn't really grip at all. The Nexus 10 definitely has a softer perimeter. The iPad feels comfortable in landscape or in portrait mode, whereas I felt a bit more comfortable holding onto my Nexus 10 in landscape mode compared to portrait. The Nexus 10 has a GPS. The iPad 4th Gen has that option, but with the cellular model only. Apple has hundreds of thousands of applications optimized for the iPad screen. I had to turn to the Tabified Market HD app on the Nexus 10 to find a handful of apps optimized for large screens on the Android platform. And whereas I could run any application available in the App Store on the iPad, some of the apps I wanted on my Nexus 10 simply weren't compatible with it. The cameras on the iPad 4th generation are just fine. Seemingly no better or no worse than the cameras on the Nexus 10. But at least the Nexus 10 gives you a flash. These cameras are each perfect for video conferencing. These cameras, I just don't see anybody using all that much. The Nexus 10 has support for NFC. The iPad doesn't. As far as network support's concerned, they both seem to work equally as well on Wi-Fi, at least in my experience. But you should also note that only the iPad comes with a 3G or 4G option. Can't get that on the Nexus 10 yet. Neither of these two devices has the option for expandable storage. At least, not out of the box. And as far as connection options are concerned, the Nexus 10 has a headphone jack located next to the micro USB port, and, on the other side, HDMI out. The iPad has its headphone jack at the top, and the Lightning connector at the bottom. But despite the lack of an HDMI port on the iPad, there's still a video out option, and I'll get to that in a second. The iPad has a single home button. The Nexus 10 has 3 buttons, all of which are rendered in software. The advantage of the software button becomes apparent when you rotate the screen. Those buttons change position. I don't know if one option is clearly better than the other, but there is something to be said about not accidentally swiping a physical button. The iPad speaker is located on its back. The Nexus 10 speakers flank the screen. As far as audio quality goes between the two,
with magic everywhere.
and while I appreciate the position of the speakers on the Nexus 10, it seems that the iPad 4 produces a richer sound overall. The Nexus 10 speakers are definitely treble heavy, to my ears. And yes, I realize the iPad 4th Gen is not called the iPad 4, it's just sometimes easier to call it the iPad 4. There are a lot of different numbers to remember. And now it's time to check in with the biased fish. On the iPad 4th generation, at approximately 60 frames a second, we have 100 fish swimming across a window size of 981 by 644. On the Nexus 10, at approximately 39 frames a second, we have 100 fish swimming across a window size of 980 by 490. And here's how they look with 250 fish on each screen. They're definitely swimming faster on the iPad 4th Gen. Between the two, the iPad screen was definitely more responsive to the touch. Overall, scrolling in applications on the iPad 4 was relatively smooth, although I gotta tell you, there was a bit of stutter here and there. But nowhere near the amount of stutter that I found throughout the Nexus 10. While I definitely experienced graphical rendering inconsistencies on both devices, they were a bit more pronounced on the Nexus 10. Oh, don't dim on me. I'm not letting you off the hook. Seriously, the iPad 4 has stutter. If nothing else, it just tells me that both companies have a lot of software optimizing to do. The iPad 4th generation experience was generally a bit smoother than the Nexus 10. As far as battery life is concerned, it seems the Nexus 10 drained a hair faster than the iPad 4. If you crank up the screen brightness to 100 on the Nexus 10, the battery drains fast, and therein lies the compromise of having such a high resolution. But that's important to keep in mind, especially if you plan on doing a lot of reading. Anything less than 100% brightness on either device may give you a headache, but I could probably get through an entire day without recharging on either one. Shall we play a game? Interesting. There are more dynamic elements on the iPad 4th Gen compared to the Nexus 10. You get window reflections on the iPad 4, not on the Nexus 10. Your games just may look better on the iPad 4. Zenbound 2 plays smoothly on the iPad 4th Gen, and the animations are almost as smooth on the Nexus 10, but not quite. Here's BrowserMark 2.0 on the iPad 4th Gen, and the same benchmark running on the Nexus 10. Nice cube spins. The animation is a bit smoother on the iPad 4. The BrowserMark score for the iPad 4 is 2624. The tests are still running on the Nexus 10. Benchmarks certainly give us a better idea of how one device performs when compared against another, although it never seems to be that we're comparing similar devices, similar hardware, similar software. I mean, there's a difference between the two, usually, and it's more than just how fast or how slow one performs over the other. In other words, we really got to start learning to ignore specs. Instead, look at real-world performance. Look at how that device works in respect to your specific needs. I mean, who cares if it does something that you don't want? You need it to do the thing that you want. Or at least you should. The latest and greatest doesn't always mean the greatest for you. There we go. The Nexus 10 scored a 2120. Not bad, but it just speaks to my perspective that both platforms need a bit more software optimization. I'm sure there are other ways to compare these two devices, it's just that I only have so much time in the day. I could get a 16 gig Wi-Fi only version of the Nexus 10 for $399. $500 for a 32 gig Nexus 10 versus $500 for a 16 gig iPad. But price and storage aren't the only things that should factor into your consideration. So does the value of either device match its base price? Yes, for both. Things I love about my Nexus 10 include Daydream. That's available in Android 4.2. It's like a screensaver, and it's awesome, especially on a big screen. And while I don't plan on sharing my Nexus 10, having multi-user support built into Android 4.2 is nice, especially for families. You may not want to share your pocket computer with another person, but it's different with a tablet computer. And another thing I love on the Nexus 10, the idea of widgets. I have quite a few widgets installed, it's just that they don't all really look that nice. But yes, I bought some beautiful widgets too. That's a nice screen. A really nice screen. And I happen to like a few things about my iPad 4th Gen as well. I have hundreds of iPad screen optimized apps installed and thousands more available to me. Yes, those are all folders. As I said earlier in this video, I also appreciate the generally consistent experience I get on an iPad. The experience tends to be more fluid. Some people don't care about fluidity. I do. I also appreciate AirPlay mirroring, which is a feature that allows me to broadcast anything on my iPad screen up onto an HD TV that has an Apple TV connected to it. And even if I can't mirror everything that's on my iPad screen, it's still a convenient feature to have built in. And mind you, I have a Google TV and an Apple TV. And remember, for either platform, that a third-party application may very well make up for a system feature that might be missing. So which one is better, the Nexus 10 or the iPad 4? Well, given that what you want is completely different from what anybody else wants or has, I don't know if I've got an answer. For some, the iPad 4 is perfect. For some, the Nexus 10 is perfect. It's not so much about this device or this device living on its own. It's about each one living with a family of devices. Two different ecosystems with a little bit of crossover. If you're the kind of person who appreciates features over finish, you'll be happy with the Nexus 10. And that's not to say that the iPad doesn't have features. It's just that it excels at finish. While you can't go wrong with either one, it kind of depends on what you see as right. Sometimes the hardware seems nicer than the software, and other times the software seems nicer than the hardware. It's when they can both run in conjunction with one another that you have a good experience. No doubt, with software revisions, each device is going to get better. Apple has more products that work with one another. Google's got a sweet set of internet services, although you can get to a lot of them from the iPad. Better, once again, is relative, though the whole remains greater than the sum of its parts. iPad 4 or Nexus 10? Which one would you choose, and why? And even if we don't value the same things, I do hope you appreciate this video.